Tim Kane, J.P. Conte Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and very happy to have you all here for the publication event surrounding Total Volunteer Force, following a proud tradition of work done at the Hoover Institution over many decades by some very distinguished colleagues of ours who were part of the movement to create the all-volunteer force in the 1960s and early 1970s. So we've got a great panel today, and really honored to have one of my colleagues as a keynote, Gary Roughead. So let me introduce Admiral Roughead. He's the Robert and Marion Oster Distinguished Military Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He also served as the 29th Chief of Naval Operations. Now, prior to serving as the CNO, Admiral Roughead was the commander of the U.S. Fleet Forces Command and the 31st commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He's one of only 2 officers in the history of the United States Navy to have commanded both the Atlantic and the Pacific fleets. Admiral Roughead has received numerous commendations and awards for his military service, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, Navy Distinguished Service Medal, Defense Superior Service Medal, Legion of Merit, Meritorious Service Medal, and many more. So will you please join me in welcoming Admiral Roughead.
Well, thanks, Tim, and I'd like to thank Hoover for hosting the event, and would really like to recognize and commend Tim for the work that he's done, and more than just the work that he's done, the passion and the drive that he has on this important topic of personnel reform. And I would also like to thank him for allowing me to offer some thoughts before we begin the panel discussion. I served in the Navy for 38 years. That's a long time. Or as one of my carrier sailors, a young ordnanceman, told me when we were having dinner on the mess decks of the Abraham Lincoln shortly before I retired, when he absorbed the length of service that I had, he just looked at me and said, "That is longer than my mother has been alive." Not a very politic answer on the part of a young sailor. But I think what it does show is the generational chain that exists within our military, the draw that our military has across our country and even beyond as young people from around the world come to the United States and serve in our armed forces as a path to citizenship. When I was asked many times why I served, and I look at people who, by the cut of their hair, I can tell have been in the military at one time, and also some of the uniforms in the audience, I think we would be in unanimous agreement that it's not for the money. Clearly, my enjoyment came from doing what I did, being at sea, and being around a great group of young people whose drive and determination and ingenuity and the camaraderie that only exists in military units, that was really what energized me and what kept me around for as long as I did. And throughout that entire period, there was no question in my mind that those who were serving did it because they felt that they were making a difference. And even during the low times, which I had the experience in my career to witness, low times in retention, and also readiness. They always felt that they were making a difference. And I think it's also important, in my time in the Navy, I had many opportunities to expose visitors, American and foreign, friends and not so friends, to the power of our Navy. To be able to take them on some of the most advanced submarines, aircraft, ships, which were technological marvels, and they were always impressed with that technology, and it made an impact on them. But what really came through time and time again was the awe that beheld them when they saw the young people that we had serving, what they did and how they did it, and the qualities that they saw in our people that oftentimes didn't translate into those who served in their militaries. In fact, recently on a quiet Beijing evening, after a long dinner and even a longer day of talking about such unemotional things as the South China Sea. And over a few beverages, a very senior Chinese general, in this quiet conversation, not charged with emotion, but a very serious conversation, looked at me and said, "How do you get your people to fight so well?" It was puzzlement on his part. It was, I think, respect on his part, but it was also of great concern to him because he knew that the power of our military resided in our people. Now, Tim's recommendations seek to do that which enhances, as he says in the book, having the right people in the right job. And that, in my mind, moves us toward policies that will best enable us to attract and to recruit and to retain those in the coming decades with the qualities that we have come to associate with the men and women who serve in our military. Nothing, in my mind, is more important than that. And I would also say that nothing is more complex than that. There are many recommendations out there. Tim has put forth some superb recommendations and ideas and the rationale behind them. I'm involved with the Bipartisan Policy Center on a similar project to look at military reform. The Department of Defense has ideas, the services have ideas, Congress has ideas, others have ideas. In fact, I think there probably are as many recommendations floating around as there are people that serve in the military, and that exponentially increases by the number of recommendations from people that have served in the military, because the retired are always willing to offer an opinion, as I'm doing tonight. These examinations and the recommendations, I think, are not unusual. They happen all the time after periods of protracted conflict. Vietnam was followed by the Gates Commission and the creation of the all-volunteer force, which in my mind, when you talk about all of the technology that's out there, the real revolution in our military affairs was the creation of the all-volunteer force, because it really did create a force like we've never seen before. The reviews and the recommendations are really driven by concern that the experienced, proven leaders that, in our case today, have taken our country through over a decade of conflict, that those proven leaders will opt for more lucrative or perhaps more welcoming pastures. And today's concern is also driven by the competition for the talent needs of our time, case in point being cyber competencies that are not only needed within the Department of Defense, but are in great demand in the financial sector, in transportation, in utilities, and medical, and we could go on with that. And it's also driven by the fact that we're confronting the reality of the increasing and really the unsustainable costs, in my view, of the all-volunteer force as it's designed today. And these recommendations go a long way toward taking a look at how you can create a force that not only has the competencies and the quality, but is also sustainable. I think for those who are involved in dealing with personnel reform, it's important as we implement some of these recommendations to keep in mind that I believe retention and readiness is really driven by two things. And I bin them in the categories of quality of life and quality of work. And too often, I think we focus only on the quality of life. But, you know, what is quality of work? In my mind, it involves the capital investments that our country will make in things, whether it's a ship, a submarine, an aircraft, ground vehicles, the kit that our ground forces take into harm's way. Those are the things that enable the missions to be accomplished. And it's also about investments in readiness, in the parts, the training, range complexes, consumables such as ammunition and just the fuel that we use to go out and train, predictable maintenance periods that allow those capital things to be maintained and be ready whenever the nation may need them. Because it's those things that really allow our people to go out and hone the skills, develop the competencies, bring up the new generation of operators and warriors that will enhance their probability of success and indeed probability of living. Now, my experience having entered the Navy at a time of very low readiness and a very low propensity to serve shaped my thinking on this at an early age. Retention in the force at that time was, to be generous, I would say, was abysmal. Although I happened to serve on one of the best retaining ships in the Atlantic Fleet. It was a cruiser, and our first term reenlistment rate, in other words, after the first period of service, those who elected to do it again, if you will, and we were one of the best ships in the Atlantic Fleet, was 16%. That is a staggering number, and so far from what we see today, but it was indicative of the propensity to serve. Similarly, in the readiness category, which I put into this quality of work, between 2 7-month deployments on that ship, we had the opportunity to get underway for 11 days of training between those 2 deployments. And to this day, my palms still sweat when I think of getting underway on that second deployment, because not only were things in a poor state of readiness, but if you overlay that retention factor, the number of new people who had never been to sea was pretty extraordinary. And so that's really caused me to focus on this aspect of quality of work. And I think as we go forward, we need to think about it. And even this morning, as reported in the press, the Secretary of Defense, in providing his budget direction, highlighted readiness. And I think he's got it exactly right. But on quality of life, I think it's important as we deal with all of these recommendations that we focus not just on the active force. It has to be applicable, and there must be a coherent reform approach taken in our guards, in our reserve forces, and in the civilian component of the Department of Defense. Not just government servants, but also the contractor resource that we have used extensively in recent years. And without that balanced approach, I think it's very likely that we'll be very satisfied that we've moved forward some reforms that apply to the active force, but inevitably the lack of reform in those other components will produce a budget drag that will ultimately come home and roost on the active force. And so I think we have to look at it in its entirety. I think all of the personnel reforms as well must take into account changes to how we deal with matters of the family, whether it is in spouse employment, child care, which I think will continue to be an increasing factor, or other family support needs. Reform must be made in that area as well, and I think those here who deal in that space know that that will not come cheaply. But on the active force, I'd like to highlight a couple of things that Tim has covered so well, and one is the idea of merit. Getting promotions and assignments more merit-based, in my view, is an absolute imperative. Concomitantly, more flexible compensation needs to be put in place that addresses merit, that addresses deployment cycles or deployment lengths or deployment pace, flexible compensation for hardship assignments. I think all of this is going to have to be a necessary part of reform packages. And I think we are well beyond the point where we can do this using some of the more agile existing accounting and dispersing systems. We can be much more flexible and how we compensate our people. I think the frustration with the up or out model is something that really needs to be addressed. We lose far too many good people because of the too inflexible time and service, time and grade promotion constraints. As a pre-DOPMA sailor, I'm a great proponent of this. And I talked about the first ship I was on, a cruiser, the largest combatant in the fleet, was commanded by a 32-year-old during my time. And so I think that there is more than enough room to be able to flex some of these time and service, time and grade requirements. And it also allows us to keep people around without promoting them when they find the niche that they like, where they can gain fulfillment from their competencies and apply them to that niche. I think we also, as we deal with these reforms, we have to have a thoughtful way of addressing the stakeholders. Obviously, those who serve, the families, but the administration, Congress, and the advocacy organizations. And I would say that the advocacy organization engagement is very, very important because all too often, and my experience has been that those organizations bend to the desires and the direction of those who have served and don't make the hard calls on what will be required for those who are coming along in the future. I think we must also remember that at the end of the day, it's about maintaining a force that can fight and that can win, and that the mission and the needs of the service really must be paramount in our thinking. Assignment marketplaces, sabbaticals, on and off ramps among active reserve guard and even civilian occupations are timely, and I believe those changes should be made. But we also always have to keep in mind that the mission and service needs are paramount. And so now I think is the time also that as we look at these reforms, we have to look at how we can predict what the nature of the force will be, what the propensity of the force will be to serve and to continue to serve 10 and 20 years from now. And I think as we also move forward with reform, we also should think about readjusting the expectations of service. And I come at that from my belief that we have made the operational tours too short. We have put increasing demands, and this is particularly apparent in my view in the officer ranks, on joint requirements, professional military education, advanced degrees, overseas assignments, language proficiency. And these tend to be staff assignments that detract from operational tour length, from building the operational proficiency that only comes from repetition, and importantly, the ability for those who have gained significant operational experience to be the good teachers for those who are going to follow. If you've only checked the box once, how proficient, how competent are you? And I think we really need to look at that. And that churn of assignments also puts strains on other aspects of how one views their career. Do you move for an advantageous promotional opportunity as opposed to garnering a lot of operational experience? And also with a more frequent moves inevitably put strains and demands on families, on finances, and on education needs of children. So there's no question that reform is hard, but I think coherent reform is harder. But with the ideas such as those that Tim has put on the table and others, if we can be forthright in how we assess the cost and the impacts and the benefits and not sugarcoat things, if we are willing to look to the future and not be anchored to the past, but still draw on the past for things that we may have been able to do a little bit better, then I think we can build a force that will be ready in the future, much as the force of today has performed so well over a very protracted period of time. So Tim, I congratulate you on the work that you've done, the ideas that you've put forth, and I thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. Thank you very much.
Great. All right. So I'm going to go through a presentation about what's in this report. But before I do want to extend thanks to the team at Hoover. The Hoover Press that put this together with me has been fantastic. Paige, who runs the office here, has always been fantastic. Great working with her and the team here. And, of course, to have colleagues like Gary and Jim Mattis. So I was in the room here with Jim Mattis and Corey Shockey when they launched their book. So of course, we're excited that Secretary Mattis has been appointed to lead the Department of Defense. But it's been really exciting to share these ideas. And I want to say first, very humbly, Admiral, when you mentioned these are my ideas, even when I started down this journey of focusing on personnel reform, I didn't have confidence that I knew what the right answers were. I've been out of the service for quite a while. And so I started this with asking soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen what they thought. And that's where all of these reform ideas come from. If my number one critique of the military today is they're not doing exit interviews, right? They're not asking their own people what they think would work. And to me, this is a bit of disrespect in thinking that if you give enlistees and officers more control over their career, they'll make the selfish choice. That was the same critique that was made when people started saying there should be an all-volunteer force. You can't have an all-volunteer force in a long war. Well, we've been in a long war for over a decade, and the all-volunteer force has been vindicated multiple times over. I think we need to take that one step further and trust our commanders and the troops they lead a little bit more than the centralized bureaucracy that's sort of seeped in and taken control. And 2 of the last 3 Secretaries of Defense have called out this as a key issue. So I'm just trying to reflect what I'm hearing. That's what I can do as an economist with a bit of military experience. But it's an honor to have taken this role as a point person in the debate and to bring that sort of mirror of what's really happening. So with that, I'm going to go through a presentation and highlight some of the substance in the report, close with what the report itself actually opens with, which is I'm going to read the 20 recommendations that we've come up with. So I do have a clicker. Let me see if the clicker works. Maybe there's a power switch. Matt, you know? I click every button until it goes. There we go. So the first point is there's a lot of misinformation about what happens or who serves and why they serve. There's a man that I respect tremendously, Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve, left to join the Brookings Institution relatively recently, but off the cuff made this remark in 2015 at an event, that if you go into the military at age 18 versus someone who's identical in the private sector, 10 years later when you leave the military, your skills and wages are not going to be quite as high on average as a private sector person. That is incorrect. He was paraphrasing incorrectly a report that was done by a colleague that was critiquing the military when it was a draft-based service. They looked at, in this study, service members in the 1960s, and the report specifically critiqued how the draft wasn't good at providing skills, completely irrelevant to the all-volunteer force. So Ben Bernanke's a smart guy. He's a hero to me in a lot of ways. I reached out to him afterwards and asked if he might like to correct the record, and he leave that conversation private, but he said, no, I trust you're on the right track. So, but once he said this, as someone who's reflecting the notion that the men and women who serve aren't as well off, aren't as smart, aren't as skilled, it's just not true. Here's another person I don't respect as much as Mr. Bernanke, but Michael Moore in his famous film was talking about how these recruiters are like predators going after uneducated people in the or uneducated young men and women to join the service. And the New York Times, paper of record, said that very few of the soldiers fighting Iraq are coming from the privileged economic classes. Factually incorrect. Here are some of the all-volunteer force facts. For 44 years, it's been a success. Every man and woman going to war has been doing so of their own volition. It's the way it should be. I think that's the answer, Admiral, to the Chinese general who wants to know how and why they fight, because they want to be there. They believe in their mission. The average reading level of new soldiers joining the force, it's a full grade level higher than the average civilian in this country. These are enlisted, it's not even counting officers. So pretty amazing brain power in these young men and women. Graduation rates are extremely high as a requirement. And point number 4, very few Americans even qualify to serve in the military. We're talking about an extremely elite force. And then research that I did years ago, talking about the underprivileged, for every 2 U.S. recruits coming from poor neighborhoods in America, there are 3 coming from the richest neighborhoods in America. So it's just really profoundly different factually than what the perception is. And maybe that's an overhang of the draft era, but it's time to put those bad ideas away and realize what the real challenges we have are. So here's one of the charts coming from the report showing how few people actually serve. Less than 0.5% of the U.S. population. So you hear that the real 1%ers are those men and women on active duty. This chart, though, doesn't show the reservists or guardsmen. It does show veterans. And so when we count veterans, it's maybe 1 out of 11 Americans are serving or have served. It's a pretty big part of our population. But there's no fair way to draft and get the right people in the service. Volunteerism lets us get that elite sliver that's there, and you can barely see in the upper ranks. But those are our heroes, and I think they deserve respect, and they deserve respect from the Pentagon. Here's another important chart from the report. Just trying to do some demographics and studying the personnel that serve. We actually have a smaller and smaller percentage of the U.S. population in service. Very expensive, but also very elite. But in terms of the U.S. as an empire, I thought this was interesting. The percentage of American troops stationed abroad relative to the world population has been going down dramatically. And if you chart these things out in 2030, we won't have a military and they won't be deployed anywhere. I don't think we're going to go there. I sure hope not. Now, the energy for reform is real. This is a quote from Senator McCain. There are quotes also in the report from Senator Reid. Beauty of this issue is it's bipartisan. Mackenzie Eaglen, who will come on stage with me, who's been in think tanks like I have for a long time, we've been working on this with our colleagues from across the ideological spectrum. It's really exciting. There's a lot of momentum for reform in Congress and in the services at all ranks. So what I did in this report was, first of all, to meet a challenge that Jim Mattis gave to me and made me not call him General Mattis, but now Secretary Mattis gave to me 3 years ago. He read Bleeding Talent and he said, that book is great, talks about a symptom. What's the problem? You haven't identified what's the underlying problem. Big task for me was to create something where I can analyze an organization on 2 axes, its leadership culture and its talent management. Came up with this leader talent matrix to do that, presented 40 statements like the one highlighted in blue, and then asked people who are employed in that organization, is that always true? Is it always false? 5-point response rate. So we can look at the strengths and weaknesses on these 2 different axes. And here's what we find. These are responses from 360 either veterans or active duty service members. On the leadership culture, military is very strong, world class in a lot of the areas. One question in particular under purpose is, does the organization have a strong sense of purpose? That's off the charts. I mean, it's very strong for the military. And it turns out that's one of the top factors in an organization that's strong at retention. So the military is doing a good job at retaining talent because it has a strong sense of purpose. Unfortunately, its weaknesses are glaring. In terms of talent management, these are very poorly performing organizations, and it's across the board. Question here, or same responses, but broken out by the 3 largest services. You see Navy, Air Force, and Army tend to mirror one another. I think the one highlight might be that the Navy does performance evaluations in the far right category better than the other 2 services. I didn't know that when I started working on this. I thought they were all bad. Turns out the services have very unique performance evaluations. And God bless the Navy and the Marine Corps, they're even better. In fact, I looked at private sector organizations for best practices. There is not a better performance evaluation system I've seen anywhere than the U.S. Marine Corps. And the Army and the Air Force could learn a lot from just going around the corner and asking their colleagues, how do you guys do it? Here is same data, broken out by rank. Turns out Admiral higher ranked officers think promotions are just fine. But in general, you're seeing disgruntlement. Even among the highest ranked officers, 06 level, there are well-known flaws in compensation. Not that people think they're not paid enough, that there's very little merit in how we're paying people in the service. And people of all ranks agree with that. So ultimately, this is what I'm proposing, a change in how job matching works. This is the status quo, that there's a labor pool at current units. Going through the personnel centers are assigned to units. Commanders have very little say in that process. One of my favorite meetings was when I was allowed to go visit Navy Personnel Command, and I sat down with all the assignment leaders there, 06s, and they said, Tim, that's not true. We honor by name requests. Any admiral calls, we'll honor that request. And I said, I got it. Are admirals, captains of destroyers? And they said, no, those are 06s. And I go, well, do you honor an 06's by name request? And he goes, that was the answer, right? We need to have a by name request system or some sort of system where commanders of operational units have a say in who's on their vessels, in their brigades. So what I'm proposing is something that looks like this, not going to the other extreme of creating an old boys club of commanders, but having maybe the personnel centers recommend 3 candidates, 3 nominees that then have to be interviewed, and the commanders have some say in who comes to join them. So this is going to contrast, digging into that leader talent matrix, some of what I think are the problems, as Secretary Mattis would challenge me. You can see the values category, some of the strengths by question, but in performance evaluations, extremely weak, in particular, the last one is assessments of supervisors by peers and subordinates are considered. The military doesn't really consider peer assessments. There was a big RAND study saying we don't see how 360s will work. I completely disagree. I think we have to do this if you want to solve what's known as the toxic leader problem. On promotions and assignments, some of the weakest points can be highlighted here that go beyond just the category level. One of the single weakest areas is local supervisors have primary authority for hiring, not the central bureaucracy. That was almost always false, a minus 1.4, where a minus 2 would be the lowest. In terms of promotions, I didn't have this final point even in the survey until I got responses from some of the NSAF fellows at Hoover. Poorly performing employees are never promoted. They said that's a big issue, is how do we deal with poorly performing workers in the military? And then moving on to compensation, again, in contrast with the strong purpose category, the weakest one here is bonuses are used effectively to reward good work, a minus 1.6. Pay is closely aligned with performance. So how can we fix some of those things? Let me shift to talk about solutions very quickly. I'm going to just show this for a second. The Admiral was right. There have been more and more reform plans than we could count, starting with the Gates Commission in 1970, recommending a lot of the same things here, where they said, yes, you need an all-volunteer force, but to make it work well, you need to include some of these. And it doesn't mean paying people more. It means paying people more nimbly than we're doing right now and rewarding merit. In particular on compensation, a lot of people I've spoken with thought that the MIC reforms, which were a huge step forward because at least something changed in how we do retirement, but the 20-year cliff didn't change. So I did an analysis of what each year of service is worth to an officer. And you can see that 20th year of service, that pension, is worth about $1 million. So if you were to leave the service in year 19, you lose your cliff vesting at year 20, you essentially are leaving $1 million on the table. Well, they did reform that. So instead of getting the 2.5 match, now it's a 2% match for each year of service, but the cliff is still in place. This is from a labor economist perspective, an extremely perverse incentive that locks people in. And just for contrast, is illegal in the private sector. Private sector, you can't have a cliff vest more than 7.5 years because it's too coercive. So let's move away from coercion, move to a smoother compensation system, and extend careers. Lastly, I'm going to talk about how the TVF will work. I'm going to just read off some of the recommendations, and I think in the interest of time, I won't read them all. They're certainly in the report and eager to get your feedback, but I'm excited to get the panel up here and hear their feedback. So recommendation number 1 is restore service chief authority over promotion tables. Fundamentally, this means reforming DOPMA, and we need Congress to be involved. Recommendation 2, though, is restore command authority for hiring. Congress doesn't need to act on that. The services can put in place a job matching program like was sketched out in the chart I showed. 3 is restore command authority for dismissals. Don't make it an all or nothing. Don't leave empty billets when a commander has to remove a bad performer. 4 is give more career control to individuals and trust them. Certainly, I'd like to see job matching boards, and we're actually seeing some of that happen right now in the Air Force. There's a move to do that. Green Pages in the Army highlighted it. Recommendation 8 was increased tour lengths. Increased tenure and career lengths. Number 9, I'd like to see a 40-year career norm instead of a 20-year career norm and not lose people at peak productivity. Number 12, end selective service. There was a debate about having women in the draft, and I thought the right answer to that, especially if we want equality, is we really shouldn't have a draft. It costs over $20 million a year to have a program that we're never going to use. I think unless aliens attack, we won't be drafting people because we realize that's not the way to build the most effective military. And then I'm going to roll down, I think one of the more important things that I didn't have time to give in this presentation, but we really need to have more pay flexibility. I point out there are already tools in place. The AIP program, Assignment Incentive Program, allows up to $3,000 a month by law now that the services essentially don't use to put people in the right jobs, the hard jobs. So my last recommendation is number 20, conduct regular personnel policy moves. I interviewed 360 people who are veterans, many more who are non-veterans, and compared the two. That could easily be thousands and thousands of thousands. Any of the service chiefs could do a personnel review, like using the leader talent matrix or something like that, and that would be very persuasive data. Right now, we have all these recommendations that I've made and others have made. There really isn't a voice on the other side. It's institutional momentum, and I think, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to change that, if not this year, next Groundhog Day. So, let me go ahead and introduce our panel, and if you all want to come up and seated, I'll read off your bios, and what I'm going to ask is we'll go down from level of experience least to most. So Mackenzie, you're going to be up first as a fellow egghead like me, and then France, and then Miriam. So sit wherever you want, guys, but I'll introduce you as I'll have you speak. So Mackenzie Eaglen is a resident fellow in the Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where she works on defense strategy, defense budgets, military readiness. She's worked on defense issues in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the Pentagon in the Office of Secretary of Defense. In 2014, she served as a staff member of the congressionally mandated National Defense Panel, a bipartisan blue ribbon commission established to assess U.S. defense interests. She's also been named twice as one of the 100 most influential people in U.S. defense. So, very happy to have you here, Mackenzie. France Hong is President and Chief Strategy Officer of MAG Aerospace and also a partner at FH&H, a veteran-owned and veteran-led law firm here in town. Previously served as an associate White House counsel and special assistant to the president from 2007 to 2009. What do you do after that? Well, France volunteered and was mobilized in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, where he served as senior executive officer of a U.S. Army Special Forces company on a 7th-month combat deployment in eastern Afghanistan. He had also served previously in the former Yugoslavia and during his active duty career. Now, something else you need to know about France Hong is he was born in Saigon in 1973. Came to the United States in a big hurry in 1975, thanks to the U.S. military. He also graduated in the top 1% of his class at West Point, which I think puts you in like the top 10% at Air Force. But, no. Very smart guy. I'm honored to call France a friend and to have him here today and to give us a private sector perspective. And then Miriam Krieger, an Air Force fighter pilot, an F-16 pilot, now serving as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. Miriam joins us today in a personal capacity, representing her own views. She was, however, selected for the 2012 CSAF PhD program and is pursuing a PhD in international relations at Georgetown University. She's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, class of 2004, was awarded 2 significant postgraduate scholarships during her senior year. So with that as our introduction, Mackenzie, will you lead off with some comments and feedback?
Sure. Well, thanks, Tim, for having me and for the great remarks from Admiral Roughead. We have been thinking about this truly for many years, which I think is a sign of a great scholar at a think tank, is to look around corners, to be a leading indicator of where policy debates may go in the future. And back when we were talking about this at another institution, I mean, this was not a subject that I think people thought we would be talking about in 2017. It actually goes back, of course, to 2010 in the QDR independent panel work. But so I was thinking about my own experience and all of your great recommendations. A couple of thoughts come to mind. First, is there anyone better than someone who's previously worn the uniform who can take up this cause as Secretary of Defense? Yeah. Because I think, as we saw, the challenges that Undersecretary Brad Carson had with Force of the Future, and all of the turf challenges, the power struggles, the toxic culture, the issues that he confronted all around Washington, the political difficulties translating that to Capitol Hill. It's different with somebody, and I know he had been in the military as well. Yeah. Different leadership level if Secretary Mattis wants to take this on. I think that it has to be one of the top 3 priorities if it's going if there's going to be movement by the Secretary himself. And if readiness is his chief issue, which it seems to be, based on all the guidance, of course, I've read and you referenced, Admiral, then this is a key component of readiness. I don't want to think of readiness only as, combat tour rotations and, training center rotations and unit metrics and that sort of thing. I really think readiness should become much more broadly in terms of thinking about personnel, the health of the force, the morale, the happiness, the retention, all those other metrics, including the harder to identify ones like propensity to serve. So I have 2 of my cousins. I have 2. They're brothers, both Naval Academy graduates, both mid-career officers, and they're both sort of like the epitome, like they fit right into this report and the findings that you have. So one flies Romeos and Sierras for the Navy. The other's a tank commander in the Marine Corps, and both are thinking I think one's at 10 years of service and one's at 12. And they're both thinking, how fast can we get out? Oh. And for a variety of reasons. And of course, they're exactly the kind of talent that I think that we're talking about that needs to be retained. In fact, my cousin who's a Marine, told me that he's, I guess, one of a half dozen Marines who are officers who have deployed more than something like 5 times since he's been commissioned, and I guess the commandant actually tracks that because there's so few Marines who've actually, so they're asking a lot of them, and he's certainly giving a lot back, but I think that I think about them and I look at this report through that lens, and these are exactly the kinds of things that are directly relevant, and you know that because you talked to those in uniform and those who have previously served, which is why your research is excellent. So I commend you on the report and all of its findings. Only a couple more quick thoughts, which is how do you get there from here? And by that I mean, so when the QDR independent panel looked at this issue in 2010, and they proposed another presidential commission, a la the Gates Commission, saying this was before there was the military retirement commission that Obama proposed, and then Congress made it retirement and compensation reform. The genesis of all of that was the QDR independent panel, which was the precursor to the National Defense Panel. And what we had done, it was under the leadership of great thinkers in military personnel, Rudy De Leon at Center for American Progress, Dick Cohn down at UNC, and others, people who've spent careers thinking about personnel issues and actually working in the trenches of these policies. And so what we did, this was in a remarkable time at the Pentagon because President Obama had just taken office. Secretary Gates had proposed a radical, transformative defense budget and a strategy to justify it. And Congress, even though it was controlled by the president's own party, both chambers, it was remarkable that they stood up a QDR independent panel to stress test their own president's defense strategy and budget that year. And so what we were given, because there were so many non-disclosures, et cetera, under the Gates budget, the 2010, which was so revolutionary, we were given access to the data. Anything we wanted from the department, they had to hand over. And everybody wanted to spill their guts because the non-disclosures were lifted, and there was a lot to talk about. And so, and I was staffing that as well. So we poured over the data, and we looked at everything. We looked at the changing demographics of American youth. We looked at high school everything, from graduation rates for, ROTC to academy, to suicide rates, to propensity to serve, to veterans, to every possible way you could examine the all-volunteer force. We had the data, and it was troublesome. This was 2010. We could start to see cracks in the all-volunteer force then, and that is why they said, meaning cracks not that in performance and of achieving the mission, but in terms of exactly the things that you identified. People leaving that you want to keep, and people staying that you probably you could do without. And then you started to, so then a couple years go by, and you start to see all these, I call them Dear John letters to the chiefs, the why I'm quitting, were populating the internet. I'm sure some of you have read several of those. I know one person who wrote one to the Air Force chief. And I think that's a symptom also, but it speaks exactly to your report. So having watched this progression over time of this policy debate, and then out comes the commission, Congress took the carrot, the one benefit of that entire commission report, left all the sticks on the table when I would pass the carrot with the sticks, because that's exactly how you get the uncomfortable things pushed through Congress, is you hang this shiny benefit that they all want to pass. So you'll remember the Navy SEAL, the Esquire cover story with the Navy SEAL, and it was like basically he doesn't have, he's shot bin Laden and he doesn't have health care because he got out at 12, or a retirement because he got out at 12 years of service or something. Congress was ripe and prime already to do that. They wanted to do it. They loved the idea.
Yep.
But by disaggregating them and separating all of the harder choices, and by making, and when we looked at this in the QDR panel, we specifically said you had to tackle it all at once. That's why there had to be a Gates Commission. It had to be presidential level, kind of like the BRAC Commission. You had to do it in an up or down way, and it had to be all components: healthcare, education, retirement. By disaggregating them now, so a couple of challenges. Congress, even though that was I could argue that was an easy thing to do, a no-brainer in the terms of the retirement, you thought it was a Herculean effort. The advocacy groups, it was very challenging, and that was really what I'd argue was a tweak in policy.
Yeah, it was. Right.
This is the fundamental overhaul. And then I watched the implosion of Force of the Future, sadly, and all the great work that went into it, and reading drafts and iterations of it that didn't even ever become fully public. How did we get there from here? So I'll stop there, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A.
Thanks, Mackenzie. France?
Great. First off, Tim, thank you for asking me to come and speak today. When my good friend Tim, who is a patron, a scholar, one of the most careful and thoughtful people I know, asked if I'd make some remarks and commentary in relation to his wonderful work here, I said, well, Tim, I'd be happy to, but I don't have any background in this. I've never researched this. I've never written about this. I haven't thought about this anything like that. I've never been a staff officer or worked at a think tank. And Tim turns to me, he said, that's exactly why I want you to talk today. I think that makes you very well qualified to bring a different perspective, which is the perspective of industry. So just a show of hands, who's on or who has ever served on active duty? Raise your hand. Great. How about in the Guard or Reserves? Raise your hand. And how about in private industry? Okay, great. So I think part of why Tim wanted me to come and speak was because I've been in all three. I've had a wonky career, 5 years in active duty, then became a lawyer, worked at the White House, needed some time to decompress, so decided to go to Afghanistan, engage in what I refer to as alternative dispute resolution with the Taliban, and then came back and then became an entrepreneur, and then have grown a law firm and this company, Mag Aerospace, which operates planes, drones, and helicopters all around the world for the last 6 years. And we're now at 1,000 people and 200 platforms. And I've been able to see kind of the military personnel system as someone from the inside, and then now with a different perspective as someone who has to manage my own company, right? And at the end of the day, right, companies are people, right? Organizations are people. So what I'd like to do today is just share kind of three of the main things that I've taken away from my entrepreneurial time since leaving uniform for the second time, and then how they relate back to some of the recommendations that Tim made in his work, which I think are excellent. The first thing, and this has already been been hammered home by Admiral Roughead, right person, right job. That's the single most important thing. You can spend a lot of time trying to correct problems in your organization where it's just a mismatch, right? You have the wrong person in the wrong position. I remember in my early days of being an entrepreneur, we hired people and they weren't performing, and I'd be butting my heads up against the wall because I said, gosh, this is a leadership failure. Because that's what I was taught, right? In the military, if a subordinate isn't performing, it's a leadership failure. Well, you know what? Sometimes it's not a leadership failure. Sometimes the person isn't the right fit for the right job. Sometimes they're a great person, but they need to be in a different job. Sometimes they're in an altogether wrong organization. And one of the wonderful things we discovered in this entrepreneurial path with me and my partners is we had all those tools, right? It wasn't like the military. It wasn't that I had to go to fight with the ship full of sailors I started with because there's no way to swap them out in the middle. I can't just go and say, hey, I don't like the sailor. Give me that person over there. It's a lot harder in the military. But you could do that in the civilian world. But that you don't want to do that if at all possible, right? You want to develop, you want to train people. If necessary, you move them around the organization. In my law firm one time, we hired a receptionist. She was very well qualified on paper. It turned out she was a horrible receptionist. She didn't like talking to people, which is kind of a fundamental skill when you want to have someone be your receptionist. But it turns out what she was really good at, it turned out, was numbers. And she was really fastidious. And so we moved her lateral in my organization to be an accountant. And 5 years later, she's a terrific accountant. And she's doing a great job, right? That's very hard to do, I think, in an organization that is lockstep in terms of reassigning people and say, look, this is what you signed up to do. You got to be good at this. If you're not good at this, it's a failure of your leadership, right? Mm-hmm. And giving the flexibility for organizations to adopt some of that private, industry practice of being able to move people around, reassign them, even fire them, but without consequence to the individual and without consequence to the organization, I think could go a long way. So all of Tim's recommendations regarding flexible promotion timetables, hiring, firing authority, having individual career choice, talent management at the individual level, I think would go a long way towards mirroring that capability that private industry has. The second thing that we've learned, my partners and I, compensation. It gets the right people in the door, and it keeps the right people in their job, but at the end of the day, it really can't change behavior, right? I mean, we made a lot of mistakes early on in the law firm. We thought, well, we want people to do X, so we'll just give a bonus for X, right? Well, it turns out that if somebody likes to do X, they're going to do X whether you pay them or not. And if they hate to do X, they're not going to do X whether you pay them or not for it. So the key, again, is job matching, right? You get the right people who are naturally inclined and love what they do, then they will do the things you want them to do. So compensation systems should be set up first and foremost with the idea of getting the right people into the right job. So if that job requires you to pay somebody more than somebody else, then the system should be flexible to allow you to do that, right? If it turns out that we need to pay, a Marine to do X, this amount of money, but we only need to pay another Marine this much to do that, then the system should allow that, irregardless of the time they've been in, irregardless of their experience. Mm-hmm. It's about matching the job, right? And the compensation required to get the right person into that job. Compensation schemes have to be transparent. They have to be easy to understand. They've got to be clearly linked to the outcomes. Over time, we revamped our compensation schemes to be like that. At the beginning of the law firm days, we had this very complicated compensation scheme. It probably required an abacus, differential calculus, and a Ouija board to figure out. And it turned out it had no effect on people's behavior because they couldn't figure it out, right? We've now adopted a much simpler system tied towards getting the right people in the door. And in fact, it's a bit of a filtering function. The system requires people to actually take risk. Lo and behold, what do we get? We get risk takers, right? They see that and they go, gosh, that's great. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, we have other people interviewing that go, I don't know about that scheme. That seems risky to me. Great. The fact that you don't like that is a filtering function. I like the fact that you identified that. And I like the fact that you don't like it because I know now you're not a fit for the culture of the organization I'm trying to build. I designed a compensation scheme that attracts people who want to take risk. Thereby, I get the right people in the right job. Mm-hmm. The third thing that I'd like to share is that motivation factors matter most. And what do I mean by that? So there's a great book, How You Measure Your Life, and it talks about 2 factors that kind of go into whether someone's happy with their job. And there's hygiene factors, right? How much you get paid, the title of the job. It turns out those factors can only make you unhappy with work. It can't make you love work. And then there's motivation factors, which are who you work for, the meaningfulness you find out of your job, right? Do you feel like you're part of a team? And that is absolutely true in my experience being an entrepreneur, right? Motivation factors matter more than anything else. And I think that's where the military really trumps private industry. The military does a great job of letting people feel like they are part of something larger than themselves, giving them a sense of purpose in what they do. So my company, MAG, we're about 99% veterans. We've grown 100% each year for the last 3 years. People often ask, like, what's the secret to your success? And I said, it's pretty simple. We hire high performers. And they said, well, how do you hire high performers? Well, it turns out that what high performers want is the chance to perform. And they want to be around other high performers. So our pitch is literally, hey, you, Mr. Higher Performer, you're right now in an organization, and I'll bet you 6 out of the 10 people around you are not pulling their weight. 3 out of the 10 probably do their job okay, and you're the black sheep who's carrying all the weight, right? How would you like to be part of an organization where everybody else is part of that 10%, and you have to struggle every day to keep up with your peers because everyone's that good? And you know what the people at the top of the pyramid say? Sign me up. I want to be part of that organization. And then we promote people based on their performance. We recognize their performance, and then we get a culture of performance. And I think a lot of the recommendations that you had around, Tim, kind of revamping the performance evaluation system, making it 360 degrees, would tie back to that kind of environment as well. The benefit, of course, of being in an organization of 1,000 people is I have 360-degree visibility, right? When I want to make a hiring or firing decision, I can get that visibility pretty quickly. It's hard to replicate in a force of 200 or 300,000 people. But I think there are things that you can do to do that, and especially with technology. So with that, I'm going to conclude my comments. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. And I look forward to the questions from the audience.
No, thank you very much, France. Just one comment to emphasize, and I don't think I made it clear in my presentation. I've heard people say that pure evaluations are difficult and they can't be implemented in the military. I didn't know anything about Army Rangers. But apparently, peering is a very big part of the Army Ranger process. So all I've really made a recommendation is do something that's that quick and dirty and is so part of the Ranger culture and implement it Army-wide, because talent wants to be recognized and it wants to thrive. So, France, thanks for reminding me. That's such an important point. We were agreeing on that the other day. Miriam, give us a perspective. I haven't been in the service for a long time. And so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe everything's been fixed. Is that right?
No. So first, thank you for having me on this panel. This is fantastic. And for those of you who don't know, I first encountered Tim at a Brookings conference where he spoke, and we discussed bleeding talent. And bleeding talent for me was the wake-up call that I wasn't the only one who thought there was a problem. That was an extraordinary experience and started me on this quest sort of figure out what the problem is and what the solution is. And so I commend the report. I can't say enough good things about it. So what I'll say instead are some of the things. First of all, the impetus, I think, for change, and then some of the valuable knock-on effects that I see for the suggestions that you proffered. So first of all, I was on the Joint Staff when the Force of the Future report came out. I got to witness firsthand the belt sanding shotgun blast that it received from almost everyone, which was, for me, startling, because I looked at it and said, this is a bunch of great ideas. And so I would say there's a lot of reasons that it didn't gain traction, but the two biggest ones in my mind were, one, it was sort of a shotgun blast of everyone's biggest ideas, greatest ideas, which meant, ironically, not that everyone found something to like in it, but rather everyone found something to hate. And so that was a struggle. And then the other big reason, and this is what struck me and why this is such a valuable step in this process, is no one made the case that the system was broken. And so you had a number of higher level leaders, and honestly some lower level leaders in sort of the 06 ranks, in particular the frozen middle of entrepreneurial land, that looked at this and said, no, show me the evidence that we don't promote the best and brightest. Show me the evidence that the best people are leaving. And the answer was, we don't have good evidence for that. We don't have evidence for the system being broken, at least not that the services would buy. And so this is a fantastic start in that process. And so that's one of the reasons I think there's impetus for change, which is we're actually starting to look at this and in a scientific way, in an economic way, in a human resources, human capital way. And that's the first step. So a couple of other good reasons that we have impetus right now. As the Admiral said, people matter more than ever. Industrial groups are good at solving complicated problems and simple problems, but they're crummy at solving complex problems. And General Dunford, the chairman, is the first one to say that we're not getting a series of complicated problems. There are no complicated problems left to solve. We only have complex problems. We only have problems that are convoluted and in tension and paradoxical, and that requires people to solve. And in some ways, when we look at, I think it's often forgotten with the technology piece, as you mentioned, sir, that it's the institutional change that pairs with the technology that actually makes it effective. The second offset wasn't necessarily effective because we had PGMs and stealth. It was effective because we had structured an entire joint force, really, and Air Force in specific, because that's what I'm familiar with, around the idea of precise application of force, the deep strike capacity, the integration of ground and air maneuver. That's why it was successful. It helped that we had, smart bombs, but that was just a piece of it. And so that's part of it too. Another impetus for change is money. It's a good one, handy one for Congress, as Mackenzie knows. People are expensive. The right people are more expensive, and losing people is extraordinarily expensive. It costs $1 million to graduate someone from pilot training in the Air Force, and that's not including their IP cost of salary or their instructors, sortie time, the gas in their plane. It's $1 million just for that one student. That's an extraordinary cost, and that's not a combat-ready wingman. That's just someone who can go to the next course to be successful. And so when you lose those folks, it's a costly dilemma. And as you make the point of leading talent, you don't just lose them to the outside. You lose them inside the service too. You can't utilize that skill if you can't utilize that talent within the service the right way. You've lost that quality too. And on that piece as well, I think another impetus for change is we're breaking. As Mackenzie said, I mean, you could see the cracks years ago, but the reason the Air Force has tackled this personnel issue and just recently is that our prima donnas, the fighter community, is broken. It's broken. We have an 800 pilot deficit in our force. In the year group from 7 to 12, everybody who stays in is guaranteed a wing command. That's crazy talk.
Wow.
We may not even have enough people to fill out the wing commands, and we're going to have, this is like anathema to a fighter pilot, we may have like tanker guys leading fighter wings. It's tragic. No, it's probably actually good for us. I don't know. But don't tell the Air Force I said that. Too late. So that's a terrible situation to be in, and that is actually making us fundamentally relook all of this personnel stuff, which has extraordinary knock-on benefits for the rest of the force. It shouldn't take the monarchy being broken in order for us to find creative solutions.
Right.
And so that's part of it. And the last thing I'll say on the impetus for change is that diversity matters now. So I've had the opportunity to study a little bit female officer retention in the Air Force, where we lose women at twice the rate of men.
Yeah.
And if you think about a cost benefit there, that's, they're not less costly to train, so you're losing them at a higher rate. That piece of diversity is not just related to the diversity you can see in the photograph. And when we look at that, we're looking at things like spouses, as you mentioned, sir, the family. We're looking at increasingly assortative mating in my generation, and this idea that talent likes talent. An increasing number of people who are marrying professional spouses, male and female, who want to be able to support their spouse's career. As an anecdote, I did my own little personal survey. In the fighter community, we get a bonus. This goes to your point that you can't incentivize with money. It's not the best incentive. Every one of them said they would have given up the bonus, which is a decent chunk of money, if they could have picked their next two assignments. And the reason was, one, their spouse could earn more than the bonus if they could get in a place where their spouse could do it. Two, they're happier. Their spouse is happier, which means their home life is happier. And they're happier because they're theoretically choosing a job that they're interested in as well.
Right.
And so that's money saved, which solves a lot of problems, and a happier airman all the way around. So the last thing I would say then, looking at this, is the knock-on effects of some of the items here. Not only are they great for the service, not only are they great for the people, but there's some great benefits that flow there. So just for example, the idea that commanders could hire people, right now, and I'll speak for the Air Force only, you are promoted, you are a successful commander if more or less the ship stays on track. Nobody crashes an airplane, nobody goes to jail, you yourself don't commit any sort of crime, and that's a successful command. And keeping the boat steady, it should not be the mark of a successful leader. If you let people hire, build their own team, manage their people, mentor, and get them to the next place, now you're actually measuring something. Now you can actually say a successful commander can do all of these things. And that's a useful skill as you move up, so that when you are the admiral that can do the by name request, then you know that person knows what they're looking for, as opposed to the captain. And one other thing, I think, if you do the hiring process, if you do the interviewing process and the matching and whatnot, not only do you get the mindset that you were talking about how civilian industry works, you're prepping people to transition. And you're prepping them in the right way. You don't come out, for the reservists in the room or the folks who transitioned, not knowing how to look for a job, not knowing how to interview, not knowing really what you want in terms of compensation and nuance. That's an incredible knock-on effect that, again, it's a money saver, it's a morale saver, and it makes for a better service. So.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Great. So I'm gonna step aside and ask the Admiral to come up and join us for some Q&A. Thank you, sir. And last thing I would say in terms of what this report does is it doesn't recommend that all the military has to change. I think I used the word flexibility because that's really, I realized 2 years into this process, the Army doesn't have to look like the Marines and the Navy, and they shouldn't. They shouldn't have to follow the same exact promotion rules and promotion timetables. As Secretary Mattis emphasized many times, they have a very unique service culture in the Marines and the type of person that they need to serve in their enlisted corps. Different than the Air Force, different training needs. So why are we all still following the same pay table and promotion table? And so really this report is a plea to give each of those service chiefs flexibility to design the personnel rules that will work best for them. Because if the Navy wants to reform and the other three services don't, I'm fine with that, but they can't do that today. That's something that if there's one thing, and that's not a shotgun, it's have to revisit DOPMA. I think you've got the chairman of the SASC and the minority leader agree on that. So I'm really optimistic we're going to get some of the big pieces moved and move soon, not all of them. But this will have a shelf life, I hope. So with that, I just want to go to you all. We've got a great, I see a lot of friends here who are smarter than I am, so I hope we can get questions from all of you. Anyone, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll try to get a mic to you.
I've heard a lot of interesting remarks on the status of the difficulties in retaining personnel and what they need to price them at and how to promote them. And I wondered, we heard there's a need for possibly increased costs being placed into child care, incentive pay. The new president is coming, and well, he seems to want to reduce costs. I don't know if it would affect anything that you possibly have talked about here today, but it's not impossible that could impact on it, but then again, it may not. He's more following the price of equipment, which of course can't really talk and say that it needs more spent on it or less or whatnot. But what are your feelings on the total volunteer force if they have to try to get more savings? We follow the newspapers and we notice that they've reduced a lot of officers in the Army, been cuts, a lot of unhappiness has occurred, divorces, problems with mortgages, et cetera, et cetera. You can go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Well, what to be said, where can, savings be made, if any? And if they can't be made, well, then it ought to be said that it can't be done.
Thank you, sir. And who are you and where are you from?
Mr. Hedger, I'm retired.
Okay. So I'd like to hear from you all on that. My quick take is we were in a meeting, I think Kate and I were in a meeting, and someone said, how much does this cost? And I really wasn't prepared for it. It doesn't cost anything. These are just changing the rules and changing authorities. If you extend tour lengths, which is one of the recommendations, that would save money and hopefully save some marriages as well. Do you all want to take a stab at this question?
So, real briefly, I think the benefit here, and you highlighted in the report, a lot of this is cost neutral. A lot of this is more about moving the cost elsewhere. I think regardless of how you go about it, and maybe this doesn't answer your question, sir, but right now, as Mackenzie mentioned, the sticks and carrots we have are so crude. We basically have bonuses and pay as the carrot and commitments as the stick. And those aren't sufficiently calibrated to meet the needs, desires, wants of the folks that you may want to keep. And as I mentioned with the bonus for fighter pilots, people are really good adjudicators of what they actually want. We're really good at making ourselves happy. And so being able to select from, a lower monetary compensation in exchange for being able to choose an assignment costs the Air Force nothing. In fact, it saves money. Being able to stay in an assignment, now we're actually saving some major costs because we're not moving. And so I think the interesting thing here is that you're right to be cost conscious in this kind of environment, but so many of these things, knock-on effect is actually a net savings. And then add in the cost of not having to train someone new to take that jet airborne. That's a huge benefit to the service.
Admiral?
I think one of the things that is important to recognize is that the changes that we're talking about as far as getting to costs, and I agree with the cost neutrality on many of the recommendations. But if you consider that a large part of where some of this money is going are people who are not currently serving. So it's going to take a while to turn this ship, okay? But if you begin to project out, then you can begin to determine that the force can actually become less costly. But you're going to have this bow wave of costs. Because in 2014, for the first time, I ended up paying more people who had served than were currently serving. It's the first time in history that those lines crossed. So you have to accept that there's the bow wave. I think as you look at some of the retirement plans that have been put in place, clearly I think there has to be a rationalization of some of the medical benefits that are being paid. The flat line for many, many decades. Example, I could have retired in 1994.
Yep.
I retired in 2011. My medical premium was the same regardless. Now that just doesn't make sense to me. I think as you can begin to add up some of these changes, I think that refining compensation, to your point, maybe holding base and incentivizing in other ways can help in the pay bracket. I think one of the other things that has to happen is that, for example, when the pay raise is sent over by the administration, regardless of which one it is, it gets jacked up by the Congress. And that money has to be taken up in the first year that change takes place. So where do you go to get it? You go to the stuff, and you go to readiness, and it erodes. Will costs continue to rise? Yes, they will continue to rise. But to your point of being able to retain the best, not throwing that $1 million investment over the side, I think if you come at this in a more exquisite way, you're going to have a much better force, and I think a more satisfied force.
Good. So other folks thought of some questions you might like to ask. You want to raise your hand, and maybe we'll collect a couple. Go ahead.
Sebastian Bay, Foreign Policy Magazine. I wanted to ask this: the total volunteer force sort of focuses on uniformed servicemen, but the Pentagon and the defense enterprise is largely civilian, but also increasingly contractors. So how does the total volunteer force sort of deals with that element, but also the increasing focus on autonomy and drones by the military? And one quick question for the audience: can you raise your hand if you were former military or current military again? How many were enlisted? Okay, thank you.
Thanks. That's good. I'll come back to these. So can we get the mic up here for a sec? Just for the record, too, while we're waiting on these questions, my dad was enlisted, so that's always on my mind. And he reminds me of that all the time.
Kevin Kenny, I'm an Air Force reservist. Some of the reforms that we're talking about will literally take an act of Congress, but the services already have some authorities that they're not using. So that suggests that there's another issue And what is that issue, and how do we change that?
Dave Blair, Air Force officer. To the last two speakers' points, you talked about a cultural risk. I think we're seeing our adversaries actually being able to field a cultural risk, both thinking about Crimea and thinking about ISIS. And we have troops that are able to live in that cultural risk, but they're not able to get promoted in it. And then to Major Krieger's point, we talked about the second offset requiring not only humans and hardware, but the third offset's going to need humans too. It seems like a system that was built for dealing with folded gap motor rifle divisions isn't going to do real well against what those forces are fielding. So question that I would ask is, we talk a lot about the benefits. What are the costs if we don't do this? Where are we at in 20 years if we choose to stick with the 1970 system?
Hi, I'm Justin Jofrion. I'm at the Eisenhower School. One of the things economists look at is the connection between efficiency and equity. And one of the things that I've come up against when looking at bonuses is, if you pay people differently, how is that fair if they're doing the same job? And I understand that there's other forms of compensation that make that equal, but we have a real difficulty in the service, I think, especially operating in a joint environment, of saying, well, if they're on the same chopper and going the same place, how can you pay the guy in the Army less than the guy in the Air Force? And so how do you break through that inertia so that you can get to a more efficient outcome?
Good stuff. All right, I'm going to turn to the panel and talk about that. I'm going to take advantage on Justin's question. One of the recommendations is to move away from a tenure-based pay table, do a radical change in the pay table to the way it used to be in the Navy in the 19th century and part of the 20th century, which is, I don't understand why you pay someone differently if they're in the exact same job, but one person's been in for 7 years and the other one's been in for 3.5 years. And there's a pretty big tenure reward for the exact same rank and role. I would pay people based on role and responsibility equally and scrap the whole idea of tenure-based pay. I'd like to get to each of these, but I also want to, I think the panel might have some thoughts. So, Admiral, you want to start, and maybe we can...
Yeah, I'd just like to add one thing to what Tim said. I mean, when I was the Navy chief, I advocated even going back to prize money, which was the old way of really making a fortune if you were a naval officer, but that fell on deaf ears. I think on the comment about the civilian component, I believe is hugely important, and I referenced that in my remarks, that we have to look at all of them, all of the components. But I think we really have to look at the civilian dimension and the growth that we have seen in that in the past 15 years. At the same time, we've drawn down, at least in the case of the Air Force and the Navy, we've drawn down the active force. And my experience has been that whenever we want to make force level adjustments, we always go to the active force. And that's where we take our personnel from. And so we've got to get into the civilian component because it's huge. I think since 9/11, we've added 100,000 civilian employees. At the same time, the force has pretty much stayed the same. And we can't even begin to get our arms around how many contractors today at a snapshot are employed by the U.S. government. And so we have to look at a different way. In fact, when I was the chief and Senator Webb was serving for Virginia, we discussed this idea of actually having a civilian personnel component so we could actually know how many we had at any given time in the case of contractors. I think when we get into the issues of autonomy, we have to acknowledge that there is no such thing, whether it's the Air Force, the Army, or the Navy, as an unmanned system. There are people behind every one of those, and I think one of the things we have to do is look at how we design that force, and the opening argument really has to be about the manpower aspect of it. My experience had been that we go into a briefing on unmanned initiatives, and then in the overage time of the briefing, we'd get to the manpower piece. The policy I took was we're going to talk about manpower first on this unmanned system. So we really have to take a hard look at that. And on not using all the authorities, I think it's because The services don't have to, because perhaps there are some retention issues there, the difficulty of tweaking some of them, which in my view is not a reason, but rather an excuse. And we just have to get beyond that. So I'll stop there.
So I've said at other events actually in the past that force of the future and third offset strategy should be married. I mean, they should be two ideas, big ideas that are moving together.
Oh, yeah.
Unfortunately, one tends to be about technology and the other is just about the people, and there is no bridge between the two. Maybe I can convince Bob Work of that, and then he can keep making the case or start to make that case. So I agree with that completely. If you look out 20 years, I mean, what a great question, and we stick with the status quo. I'll just talk about the Air Force for a moment, because I think they've been in a trough for a while now, and leadership and strategists and thinking and debate in the service for a variety of reasons, but they put out a remarkable document recently, a new operating concept. And in it, it's basically, it's about, there's a lot of man-machine teaming. They have these vignettes, these stories, there's an afterburning F-35D, right, in their vision of the future, a little controversial, but really remarkable, that can launch pop-up satellites, that are expendable. For example, fiber optic cables getting cut, how would you deal with that scenario? But really what it's about is that making the machines and the algorithms better, and it's all about so that the decision makers in uniform can make better, faster, smarter decisions. So if you don't do anything, you cannot, all of this third offset, gee whiz, Skynet or whatever, is either useless or less helpful.